Dakota Territory, late spring thaw. A sky like hammered pewter presses low over the broken knife river. Ice rot and cottonwood roots claw at a bank already sliding. The river, swollen by snowmelt, chews fences, gulps a wagon whole, and hurls it downstream like a rib. Vultures tilt in the wind above a drowned meadow, while thunder crawls without rain. Mercy Delaney, a widowed schoolteacher turned homesteader, has been cut loose by her wagon boss and framed by a ranch heir for horse theft after refusing his advances. With a posse behind her and floodwater in front, she hears two Sioux, Oglala Lakota, boys screaming as the river drags them under a tangle of roots. Mercy can run and live, or jump and be taken. Either way, the current wants a body. She knots a rope around her waist, dives, and hauls one boy up coughing mud when a rider appears at dusk on the far bank, leveled rifle unmoving as he growls, "Put my brothers down." This account survives in a sheriff's deposition, where one name was scorched clean off the page, an undertaker's ledger that prepaid a coffin for a woman unknown, and a winter count robe bearing a tiny white figure dragging two children from a wave. In a moment you'll see why those marks don't agree, and who tried to erase the one that mattered. The bank gave way in a sound like canvas tearing. Mercy did not think. She braced her boots in the sucking mud and threw her weight backward on the rope as the younger boy's small hand slid out of hers, then caught again at the last knuckle. The older one coughed hard on the grass, thin body shuddering as he tried to rise and failed. "Stay," she told him, breath breaking into white puffs in the chill, though the air smelled of thawed rot. "Hold this line." She shoved the rope into his fists and went under again. The water was teeth. It grabbed her wool skirt and dragged it like a net. Her shoulder screamed where the floating log had struck her, and that pain kept her from blacking out. Her hand found a wrist, then a thinner forearm, then the slick threads of a cord binding a small pouch that had snagged deep in the roots. The boy weakly fought her, choking. The pouch caught like a hook. She felt for the knot and could not find it. She took the cord into her teeth, sawed once, twice again, until she tasted thread and tree and river, then yanked. They hit air together, the little one limp, the medicine pouch in her fist. She hauled both boys into the lee of the broken cottonwood. Breath sawed at her chest. She put the pouch back over the younger boy's neck without looking inside, and laid him on his side so he would choke less if he vomited. "Breathe for me," she said. "Breathe." His mouth worked. Mud streamed from it. His brother, eyes wide, flinched at each of her words and then steadied, listening the way a wild thing does when it wants to run, but knows running will kill it. He mumbled something she did not know, a name, a call. She heard hooves on rock and turned. The rider had come down the slope so silently she could not say when he'd appeared. Painted horse, wolf tail tied at the lance, now balanced across his saddle, rifle laid along his thigh. He did not need to raise it. The stillness was threat enough. Dark hair bound back, a face set like a carved thing that had seen too much winter. The older boy croaked, "Chaska," and reached one hand toward him without moving closer. Mercy lifted her empty palms. The rope cut her waist beneath her wet dress. Her teeth chattered. "They were drowning," she said, because there was nothing else to say. "I heard them. She stopped. Words would not change the river, or the rider, or the hard, flat way. He weighed her against both. He dismounted with careful grace, never taking his eyes from her. He came to the boys first, crouched, put a hand on each small chest. Their ribs rose under his fingers. He spoke to them low and steady. The older one nodded. The younger coughed thinly, a mew more than a sound. Then the rider looked at Mercy. His eyes slid to the pouch lying against the younger boy's sternum. He saw the frayed, cut thread. He lifted the pouch, inspected the new bite marks in the cord, then met her gaze again. She did not drop her eyes. "It was caught," she said. "It would have strangled him. I didn't look inside." Far downriver someone shouted across wind and water. The word itself was lost, but the shape of it said, "Hurry," and the tone said angry. Mercy knew the voices. The wagon boss had a laugh that never reached his eyes, and a way of making a promise sound as if you had already failed him. Silas Murdoc's voice was easier, a smoothness that had turned on her, like an oiled knife. She felt her jaw go hard. The rider stood in that wind until the shout came again. Then he spoke English that had been worn smooth by use. "Get up. Move." He jerked his chin toward the higher ground. Mercy pushed the boys to their knees, and then their feet. The older leaned into her without thinking, his shoulder bones knobby as loose pegs. The younger clung to her skirt with both hands. The rider took the rope from the older boy and clipped it to his saddle horn, bearing the weight as they climbed. The bank sloughed again behind them, with a wet sigh. Something big and dead rolled loose and bumped against a stump, turning slowly. She did not look to see what it was. On the flat above the cut bank, wind tore at them sideways. The sky was a bruise pressed to the hills. They passed a fence half chewed away, posts gnawed at by floodwater, like old bone. Mercy's breath rasped. Her shoulder throbbed. She had left her pack below on the grass, and the thought of it flickered and died. Better the book and spare shirt drown than the boys. The rider walked a little ahead, eyes everywhere at once. He never took his hand entirely off the rifle. They found a shelf where a root ball had torn free, leaving a pocket out of the wind. The rider eased the boys into it and stripped his own damp blanket from under the saddle. Mercy reached to help. He did not stop her. Together they wrapped the younger boy first, then the older. The younger's lips were pale blue. Mercy cupped his face between both palms and blew warm air over his nose and mouth. The older boy watched her hands like he was counting their moves. When she coughed again, the rider's gaze flicked to her shoulder and away. He scanned the river, then the south bank. Downstream, riders threaded black against the drowned meadow. One pointed, another waved a hat in a circle overhead. The rider with them, tall, hat cleaned of mud, coat too fine for this work, turned his horse toward the ford. Mercy knew that hat. The gold chain at his vest had been a thing men noticed. The man wearing it had called Mercy sensible in a tone that made the word small. He had put a hand on her wrist one night in the store and laughed when she twisted free. She forced her breathing even so. The boys would not taste her fear. A rifle crack jumped across the river. A bark blew out of the root pocket above Mercy's head. The wind took the smoke flat. The rider shifted once, so fast she did not see him move, and the lance was in his hand, and the boys were behind his leg, and the rifle was up. He did not fire. He did not look at her. He did not need to. His stillness did the talking. Another shot rang wild. The posse had no clear line. They were anger and show, not aim. Mercy spoke to the older boy, without turning her head. "Hold your brother and keep him warm." The boy wrapped his arms around the little one and blew his own breath across his face in imitation of Mercy. The rider's mouth tightened at that. He said a word that might have been praise. The rider went to the horse and came back with a strip of dried meat. He held it out to the older boy. Mercy did not move. She watched the boy choose. He looked at the meat, then at Mercy, then at his brother. He put the meat to his brother's lips first. The little one chewed with the slow seriousness of hungry children. Mercy's hands shook when the tension eased a fraction. She took off her shawl and wrung it. Water streamed. The rider's eyes fell on her hat. "You cold," he said. "Cold is death now." She nodded. "I know." He studied her a second longer. Then her waist where the rope had burned through the dress. Then the river again. When he finally spoke in more than a single word, his voice came gentle and flint together. "I am Chaska," he said. "These," he touched the older boy's shoulder. "Wichasha Chikala, little man, and Tat." He laid a hand over the small chest at the name, like he was pressing the wind back into it. "They are my brothers." Mercy nodded. Mercy Delaney. Her mouth went odd on that last name. She still said it because a name is a door you can close or open, and she needed doors that opened. The wind shifted. Across the water, someone laughed sharp. "There she is." That laugh called to none and all. "She's got the pups." Another voice said, "Kearney wants her alive." A third, lower, said something about a mare, and army brand curlicued in the way only men who had never touched a horse talked about horses. Chaska listened like a man reading a soft drum. "We move now," he said, and they did not argue. He took the lance in his left hand and the rifle in his right, and kept the horse at a trot beside them as they climbed the ridge away from the ford. The boys put their small feet where Mercy put hers. Once the younger tripped, and Chaska caught him before he knew he was falling and put him back on his feet without a fuss. Mercy's shoulder burned so hot she almost preferred the freezing water. She kept going. At a little shelf of rock under a leaning cedar, he stopped them and whistled once. Echo answered. Two figures rose out of the brush above, one older woman with gray threads braided into black hair, and a young man, whose face still held some boy. The woman's eyes went right to the boys, counted bones, found breath, found the pouch. She spoke to them low and fierce. The boys broke into sobs at the sound of her voice, the kind that mean release and not harm. Then the woman looked at Mercy. She did not step close. She did not smile. She set a line with the placement of her feet between Mercy and her family, and let that line say everything. Mercy stopped where she was. She waited. Chaska said, "Ina Red Willow," and the older woman's mouth softened for a blink at the word Ina. Mercy knew that word from school books, from the time before everything had turned to dust and hard meat. Mother. Red Willow put her hand over Mercy's heart without touching her. The space between them was a hand's breadth, but it felt like a river. She sang something then, a sound made of water and warning. Mercy knew lullabies. She matched the rhythm under her own breath, keeping her notes small as if not to spook a bird. They made a small shelter right there, a quick lean of boughs against wind, the boys in the middle, heat sharing from body to body. Red Willow ground juniper berries in a stone cup and mixed them with melted tallow and set the paste near the boys' noses so the sharpness would open them. Chaska watched the ridgeline. The young man, Red Willow's other nephew, skirted the lip to read the old game path, then came back and said something about prints in the soft. Red Willow nodded once. Mercy took off her wet shawl again and rubbed the boy's feet. Chaska crouched across from her, still as a stake. He tapped the cut cord of the pouch once. "You did this." Not a question. Mercy nodded. It was choking him. He looked down at her hands, at the blisters from a winter of hauling water and turning sod, at the rope burn biting pink into her waist, where it showed through the torn dress. He set the lance aside and took a little knife out of his belt and reached toward her shoulder. She went still, then more still. He cut the cloth away from the bruise. The flesh had gone black flour under the skin. "You will not lift with this," she said. "I will." He put the knife away and turned his head so she would not see his smile. As night fell, thunder walked the horizon without coming closer. The river chewed at itself below, like an animal tied to a stump. In the dark, the boys slept in fits. The younger woke with a cry, and Mercy gathered him before she remembered the line under her feet and looked to Red Willow for permission. Red Willow nodded once. Mercy cradled the boy against her collarbone. He smelled like wet wool and river silt and the metal bite of fear. She sang in the mean space between breathing and crying. He slept. Sometime in that dark, the sound of iron on stone came up from the south bank, shoes and hooves, where there had been soft-soled boots before. Sheriff Kearney had brought his iron shoes and his iron words. The man had a way of saying the law that made it feel like a thing he owned. He called Mercy's name once, as if it would do him any good. He called again, and offered her mercy of his own, and laughed at his pun. Red Willow's eyes were flame coals in the small shelter. Chaska's hands were loose around the rifle. Mercy said nothing. Silence is a tool, same as a rope. When the gray before dawn lifted, frost had rimmed the cedar needles. Their little shelter breathed steam. Red Willow stepped outside and breathed the day. She sprinkled a pinch of flour into the wind and watched which way it went. Mercy did not ask. Some things are not questions. Chaska had not slept. He crouched with the same stillness he had worn when he first saw her. He tilted his head. "Bugle," he said. Mercy did not hear it until he said so. Then the thin peal of brass came weak over the far bluffs. "Fort Mills?" she asked. He nodded and spat. "Upstream the ford is good for soldiers," he said. Downstream bad for you. He pointed. We go. He looked at Mercy. If you come as watched. She understood the word he did not say. Guest is not the same as kin. They moved in a small file, with the boys between Red Willow and Mercy, and Chaska, a shadow ahead that made other shadows careful. The young man ghosted the rear. The wind began to drag the smell of coffee from somewhere lower on the river. Mercy's stomach folded itself and tried to forget. The ridge rock took 4 hours to climb. Once, a rattler uncoiled in a crevice, slow from the cold. Mercy could not step around with the boys jammed in front of her. Chaska put out the lance and guided the head into a little leather noose and lifted it without killing. He set it in the sun, and it stayed, too surprised by its own life to strike. Near noon, the river changed its voice. Chaska stopped without turning. Mercy held the boys against her thighs to keep them from bumping into his back. Listen, he said. She listened with her whole body. The current had lowered a pitch, then rose. It had found a new channel or lost one. Either way, it meant speed. The ford closes by sun high, he said. They will try to push you into it. Mercy thought of the gallows in Gideon's Ford, the one Kearney had ordered built a year before for a murderer who had died in jail of fever before the rope took him. The town had left the empty frame standing because some liked the look of justice, even when it did no work. She closed her eyes and saw pine pitch dripped over fresh ropes to keep them from fraying in wet weather. They cut away from the river up a game path that smelled of old deer. Red Willow stopped at a notch and set sage across it, like chalk at a door threshold. Mercy stepped to it and stood with her hands at her sides until Red Willow looked at her and made a path through with 2 fingers. Mercy stepped through that path and did not touch the sage. Red Willow watched her and said something to Chaska that sounded like, she knows how to walk. At a rise where the land sloped like a shoulder, a trading post sat on pilings that were not high enough and had never been high enough. A dog slept under the porch with one eye open. A man who had small hands and a larger smile came to the door when he saw Chaska's horse. Trade? He called. The word made a grease sound. He wore a vest with bits of thread clinging to it like burrs. Mismatch. Chaska did not smile. Mercy had been in that post before, when she had thought she could make a life here by buying flour and sewing 2 shirts and finding a quiet corner to sleep that winter out. The man had given her a sack with less flour than she had paid for. She had waited at home and learned. They would have passed without stopping, but Jonah Pike stepped out from the shadow at the corner, wiping his hands on a cloth that had once been white and now was not. Mercy froze. Undertaker Pike had a face like a ledger, flat and lined, and more honest than men liked. He did not pretend to surprise. He only looked at Mercy, at the bruise blooming under her torn dress, at the boys clinging to Red Willow's skirt. He spoke without moving his lips much. Best keep to the bluff, he said. Sheriff Kearney sent a rider to fetch paper. He means to make it read any way he needs. And Modoc. He stopped. Modoc paid me yesterday, he said. Coffin for a woman with no name. Paid in full. Wants it delivered to the yard at Gideon's Ford before sundown. He looked at the boys, then at Mercy again, and his mouth went tight. I misliked the feel of that gold. Red Willow watched each word register in Mercy's posture, and then looked at Jonah's hands. Undertaker's hands tell the truth. They have to, or the dead would. Red Willow nodded once to him. Jonah nodded back like a churchman nods to another man at a graveside when both are cold and the prayer runs long. Chaska's eyes had slid past the clerk's smile into the shadows of the back room. He used the lance tip to lift a canvas flap and show the bridles stacked underneath, the leather thick, the marks shaved. Someone had taken a knife to the little stamped symbols on the brow bands and cut them away. The trader's hands fluttered. Took in a mixed lot, he said. No law says I have to keep. Chaska set the lance tip down again. He touched one strap. His finger came away dark with dye. Fresh, he said. Before flood. The trader laughed too fast. Cowhands cut all sorts of marks. Chaska's eyes, without looking like they changed, said he had heard what he needed. He lifted the flap again and replaced it. Mercy thought of the mare with the white pastern she had seen last month. The one Modoc had led past the post in the dark, head low with a weary sound. None of his smooth words had softened. She looked at the shaved leather and felt a cold that was not river settle in her. Jonah Pike stepped closer, as if to inspect the boys, and said in a voice meant for her alone, "There's a page in the parish book at Gideon's. Shows a funeral paid in advance. It wears the cross in the wrong hand. And there's a scrap in my own ledger, miss. Says I measured a lady for travel clothes the night your husband fell under his wagon. I did not write that line. The man who paid me pushed my hand to it. I scrubbed at it after. Ink won't leave." He did not look at Chaska when he said it. He knew where he stood and where he did not. "Who paid?" Mercy asked, though the answer had already built itself in her bones like ice. Jonah's mouth moved once like he was spitting a seed. Silas. Just that. It landed heavy. Red Willow's eyes became knives without moving. Chaska's hand tightened on the rifle. They left the post and climbed again. The river's voice changed a third time, going quick and high like a scared horse. Chaska looked up. The sky had gone a shade whiter. Upstream, the army would be picking its way toward the good crossing. Downstream, Kearney would be wetting his boots and swearing. Red Willow set her jaw as if she were bracing for something she could not stop, but would endure, like any other weather. Their young kinsman scouted ahead and came back with a whisper and 3 fingers held low. "Riders." "White? Blue?" Chaska asked. The boy flicked his hand as if to say both. "Bugles," he added. Chaska nodded, made a small sign that meant they would go the long way around and be later and live. By evening, the wind had picked up dead leaves and made them run like mice along the ridge. The boys were steadier now, their breaths not whistling like reeds anymore. Little Man walked without Mercy's hand. Tate held Red Willow's skirt and looked out from under the edge of his blanket with the careful stare of a child who has learned the world can tilt. Mercy's shoulder pounded in time with her heartbeat. She did not speak her husband's name. It seemed to her that if she said it here, the wind would take it and tell the wrong ears. They made the bluff camp under a red rock that faced the river like a man frowning. The camp was small by design. 2 lodges, one half built for when the brother's mother returned from visiting kin. Red Willow said, in a voice that did not invite correction, "A hide, stretched to dry, a line of bones whitening on a rack, a small fire sunk low to make less smoke." The boys went inside the first lodge at Red Willow's gesture and came out in dry clothes. Red Willow gave Mercy a folded blanket and pointed to a spot where she could lay that did not cross any line uninvited. Mercy lay down and stared at the underside of the hide roof and listened to the crackle of green wood and the steady breath of the boys and Chaska's quiet movement outside as he checked things. She closed her eyes and saw again the page Jonah Pike had tried to scrub, the ink stubborn as old guilt. She saw the parish cross written by the wrong hand and felt the wrongness of it in her chest like a splinter. In the deep part of night, something cried on the river that was not a person and not a fox. It sounded like rope pulled tight. Mercy sat up. She felt for the Bible she had kept under her bedroll since the first winter. The leather had warped in the flood and would never lie flat again. She placed it on her chest, because weight helps when the heart runs. Red Willow's shadow appeared at the lodge door and said very softly, "Sleep." The word held command and kindness. Mercy obeyed. Morning came with a bruise of light and a drift of smoke. Chaska was already a figure on the ridge, looking toward the fort. Red Willow's kettle breathed just at the lip. She handed Mercy a tin cup, and the heat of it woke Mercy completely. "You dove for my boys," Red Willow said, not as thanks, but as a fact that needed a home. "I heard them," Mercy answered. "The river would have kept them." Red Willow's mouth moved like she was holding back a shape, and then let it go. "The river keeps what it wants," she said. "It also spits back what it does not. This time it spat you into our hands." The line almost smiled, almost. Red Willow placed a spray of sage at the lodge door and made a small sign with her fingers that Mercy watched and did not mimic. Red Willow saw her not mimicking and the consideration in it. Later that morning, Chaska came down the ridge quick and light, not running but moving, like news. "Soldiers," he said, Kearney with them. His gaze drifted to the boys, then to Mercy. "They come with a white cloth." Red Willow's eyes flicked to Mercy's shoulder, and then to the little pouch at Tate's chest. "No cloth keeps a flood off a poor house," she said. "We will hear them." She looked at Mercy. "You will stand where you can be seen, not where you can be taken." Her voice made no room for argument, and Mercy did not offer one. She understood being placed, because some placement is protection. They went out to the open place near the rock. The boys stood between Red Willow and Mercy, each leaning outward a little. The winter count-keeper, an old man with hair like snowgrass, came forward and stood with his hands on his stick. He watched the day with a weaver's eyes. He looked at Mercy once and saw the wet dress drying and the book on her lap and the way she held herself as if she had learned to carry heavy things safely. He neither smiled nor frowned. He seemed to set her on a shelf in his mind to be used later. The soldiers came up 3 abreast until the slope forced them into a line. Lieutenant Graves rode at the front with a face from a recruiting poster and boots that had seen less dirt than they should have. He had the white flag in one hand and the other on his reins, like he wished it held a sword. Sheriff Kearney rode beside him, his hat set to hide his eyes, his mouth working even before the horses stopped. Silas Modoc came on a gelding with a coat the color of coins, and that gold chain, winking just where the sun found it. He smiled when he saw Mercy. The smile said he had already written the ending of this day in his head. Mercy looked at the chain, and then at his cuffs. The left one had a repair, where the stitching had snapped and been mended with a thread that had a tight twist and a dull shine. It looked like the thread she had cut with her teeth yesterday. The thought made her stomach turn. Graves raised the flag. "We come to speak," he said. Chaska stood 2 paces in front and did not answer. Red Willow said, "Speak then." Kearney did not wait. He slapped papers in air. "This woman," he announced, pointing at Mercy as if naming a stray, "is charged with theft of a remount and obstruction of justice. She has also been seen luring 2 minors away from lawful guardians. We require her surrender." He rolled the words as if he liked the sound. Silas kept his smile. Graves coughed once. "And we require the return of the boys to their proper people," he added, gesturing vaguely toward the river as if that could cover it both ways. Red Willow's chin lifted a breath. "These are our family," she said, each word a stone placed. "They returned from the river because she went in. They were not lured. They were saved." Chaska's voice came quiet and cutting. "You rebrand horses, Modoc," he said, as if they were at a fire and not facing guns. "You shave our marks and lie. You use papers like snares." Silas laughed like someone had told a graceless joke. "I run a store," he said. "I help neighbors make a living." He shifted his reins. The gelding tossed its head. The gold chain winked. Jonah Pike had come behind the soldiers as if he had business there, and also did not. He kept to the side and watched the wind. When Kearney rode forward to push his papers near Red Willow's face, Jonah cleared his throat. "Sheriff," he said mildly, "you'll want to keep those dry. Storm season makes ink weep." Kearney snarled and shoved the papers at Mercy instead. "Sign you were not harmed, and this can be easy," he said. Mercy looked at the place. He would have her write her name. She thought of the parish register line that did not belong, the one with the cross in the wrong hand. She thought of her husband's shirt. She raised her eyes and did not speak. Silence again. A tool. Graves shifted in his saddle. His gaze landed on Mercy's torn dress, on the bruised shoulder, on the boy's small hands clinging to blanket and skirt. Something in his jaw softened and then tightened back. He was the sort of man who wanted order and thought he knew what shape it ought to be, and he had not noticed until now that the river did not take shapes. It made them. He looked at Chaska. "If we promise safety, will she come to town with us?" he asked. Chaska's mouth made no change. "You cannot promise the river," he said. "You cannot promise Kearney's hand either." Silas leaned toward Mercy, as if the words could pass only to her. "Come back, Mercy," he said softly. "You can sleep in the storehouse. I'll see you fed. This talk of a horse will go away." He He smiled again and touched his cuff as he did it. Small, half-conscious. Mercy saw the thread. It was knotted tight at a point along the seam. Her stomach went colder. Boldness moved in her like something hard and necessary. "Where did you get that thread?" she asked, and her voice was even. He blinked, the smallest tell, then laughed. "You always were the oddest bird," he said lightly, and turned his horse as if the question itself were silly. But his hand went to the cuff again, when he thought no one looked. Chaska did not miss it. Graves lifted the flag and cleared his throat. "We'll return this afternoon," he said, though he did not look sure of what would be different an hour hence. Kearney's mouth opened to say more ugly things, but Graves's flare of eyes shut him. They turned their horses. The gelding danced sideways. Silas dragged it straight and looked back only once, at Mercy, with a kind of hot promise that made her skin crawl. When they had gone, Red Willow exhaled and turned to Mercy. "Do not go near the river alone," she said. "Not today." Mercy nodded. "I won't." Chaska met the winter count keeper's eyes. The old man nodded once. Things were said without words and settled as far as they could be. That afternoon the wind shifted colder. The river's voice lifted again to that thin high that means cutting water and broken edges. Mercy plucked the torn hem of her dress into place and went to the edge of the bluff where she could see Gideon's Ford far off, the town's roofs low, as if ashamed. She thought of her first day there, of handing a coin to the clerk and watching him bite it lightly and hand it back with a grin that said he liked the taste of other people's money more than his own. She thought of the way her husband, who had been a good man with bad luck, laughed the day they built the sod house and said, "We will fill this with books and coffee," as if those were the only two things needed to make a home. She thought of him under a wagon with his neck at a wrong angle, the coroner's notice calling it accident, the undertaker's broad hand laying him out straight, because the living need neatness, the dead do not require. Red Willow came to stand beside her with her own distance. "When the calf died last night," she said abruptly, "because life is always side by side with death on the prairie. The river took it, and I could not get it back. I cut a handful of hair and tied it to the willow. This morning, the hair was gone. That is a sign. It means the river is not done with us." Mercy swallowed. Signs, records, ledgers. She had trusted those things once because they kept the world in lines. The world had shown her it preferred smudges. "What do we do?" she asked simply. Red Willow looked at her. "We hold what is ours. We do not give the river what it has not asked for." In the blue hour before dark, the winter count keeper brought a small rolled hide to the fire and laid it across his knees. The boys came and set their small hands at the edges, as if to keep it from blowing away. He touched his stick to a year, marked by a snowflake, and another marked by a bird with a red spot on its breast. He tapped a space that would become this year's picture. He looked at Mercy. "Tell me why you went into the water for children you did not bear," he said in Lakota, and Red Willow translated only after a slow beat. Mercy thought of fitting the story into a neat shape and realized there was no neatness in it. She said, "Because I heard them and could not stand and hear them and live with myself if I did nothing. Because I had a baby and she died, and I prayed to baptize her in the river, and they said no, and I believed the river might remember and let me do some good for somebody else's child." Her voice was steady until the end, where it tripped and then set itself right. Red Willow's throat moved once. The winter count keeper looked into the fire as if a picture were rising there. He nodded as if to say he had what he needed. Night came on fast and ugly. Lightning scratched its crooked letters over the far hills and did not sign its name with rain. Chaska moved the horses to a fold of ground and set a watcher. Mercy lay on her side and tried to rest. Each time she closed her eyes, she heard rope pop in the wind. Near midnight, a crack that was not thunder broke the ridge. It cut through sleep and set everybody on edge at once. The young kinsman came from the brush on a rush of air, men moving where no men should move at that hour. Red Willow pushed the boys into the back of the lodge and pressed them there with the weight of her body, as if the lodge itself could fold around them like a hand. Chaska had already gone toward the sound. Mercy rose and followed, before she counted the steps. The night thinned enough to show 3 men where there had been none. They moved with town clumsiness. Boots on loose rock, a curse when a spur snagged. One brushed a branch and swore. Kearney had come without his white cloth. "Leave the woman," Chaska called low. He did not scream or make a show. He simply put the word where it had to be heard. The men froze, and then scattered. One ran straight for the sage line Red Willow had set. He hit it and fell as if the air itself had tripped him. Mercy did not cheer. Some lines do the work men do not understand. They caught one of the men and stripped him of his hat and the anger that had carried him up the ridge. He looked at Mercy like a man looks at rain that did not fall on his field. "We were coming to fetch you." He spat. "Make it right," Mercy said. "For who?" He did not answer because he could not say the truth, and his lie had broken its leg on the rocks. Chaska bound his hands and sat him in the cold. Dawn came dull and hard. The man watched it with the small eyes of someone who has never seen a day start without some other man telling him what it means. By afternoon, the soldiers returned. Graves rode with his mouth pressed thin. Kearney rode with a different swagger that said he had been told no and had decided to take yes anyway. Silas smiled only with his teeth. Graves raised the flag and did not look at it. "Sheriff Kearney requests the woman appear before the justice at Gideon's Ford," he said. His voice had that fought-over quality of a man saying words he did not make but had to carry. Red Willow's head tilted. "Requests is not takes," she said. Kearney let the rope in his voice show. "Enough," he snapped. He gestured, and 2 of his men came around the flank, where the brush was thinner, and fast-handled their rifles. It happened in dust, and a series of little decisions that did not look like decisions, until they had become a leaf-thin edge of a blade. The young kinsman stepped to block the sideline. Someone shouted. A horse spooked. Graves's grip slipped on the flag. Kearney's hand went to Mercy's arm and closed on bruised flesh in a way that did not count as law. Chaska moved. The men behind Kearney moved faster, because surprise makes fools bold. They dragged Mercy 1 step, then 2. The boys screamed. Red Willow's cry was lower and worse. Chaska's rifle came up, and the sound that followed was one Mercy felt in her spine more than in her ears. A crack so clean, it seemed the sky had split. The crack was not a man dying. It was the branch over Kearney's head splintering as Chaska's bullet took a cone of bark off it, so clean the sheriff's hat jumped. The horse under him plunged. Kearney clawed at the saddle and came up with murder in his eyes, and the rivers wild in his hands. Graves moved his horse between rifles and law like a man who had finally seen the edge he'd been riding. "Stand down," he snapped, and the way he said it made even Kearney's men find their fingers off triggers. The boys went silent all at once in that sucked-out quiet after a shot. Red Willow pulled them in with a look that could hold back more than bullets. Chaska did not blink. He held the rifle like a line you do not cross, and his eyes like cold water. Kearney spat a curse and made a show of laughing. "Warning shot," he said too loudly. "You'll wish you'd saved it." Graves kept his voice level. "We'll settle this in town," he said. "This has gone past the ridge." He flicked a glance at Mercy's torn dress, and the marks Kearney's fingers had made in a purple hush along her arm. Kearney saw that look and ground his teeth. They backed off like men do when one of them will not. The white flag sagged, then straightened in a gust. Silas let the gelding sidestep and smiled at Mercy, with something hungry tucked behind polite. He tipped his hat as if they were passing in a church aisle. "Afternoon," he said soft enough the others would not hear. "Think on what's best." Mercy did not answer. Silence again. He touched his cuff and turned away. The thread there made a small glint that was not gold, and somehow worse. When the dust of their leaving settled, Red Willow let out a breath and turned the boys toward work. Small hands to small tasks steadied hearts. She gave little man a bundle of dry twigs to sort by length, and Tat a wooden spoon to smooth with tallow. Mercy watched those tasks for a second longer than she had to, because the sight of children doing ordinary things after almost dying had a way of setting the world back on its feet. Then Red Willow pointed Mercy toward the creek that cut a thin line behind the bluff, clear where the river was brown. "Wash your shoulder," she said. "Make the bad water part leave." Mercy obeyed. The cold bit like truth. She gritted her teeth and let it. Chaska stood sentry where the trail came up from the river. The young kinsman moved in a wider circle. The winter count keeper dozed with his chin on his chest, but Mercy saw his fingers tracing pictures in his sleep, as if the year would not wait for him to be fully awake to be marked. The afternoon thinned. Jonah Pike appeared at the far edge of the bluff, as if he had grown out of a juniper. He carried a wrapped parcel and the uneasy air of a man doing a thing he had told himself not to do and chose to anyway. Red Willow met him halfway with her back straight. Jonah took off his hat. "Brought you dry cloth," he said to Mercy without looking long at her. "And salve. Miss Red Willow told me you'd be needing both." He adjusted the parcel like it might change shape in his hands if he held it wrong. "There's more," he added, and the weight in the words put all their ears up. He looked to Chaska, then down at the dirt. "In my ledger," he said, "I wrote what the payer asked me to write. Then I wrote what my eyes saw. The payer was Silas Modoc. The thing I saw was a mare with a scar under a fresh brand, army style on top, old mark cut away underneath." He edged a glance at Mercy. "Man like that needs a sin to cover a sin." Red Willow nodded once the way people do when a piece drops into the spot the world made for it. "Your ledger will cost you," she said. Jonah swallowed. "I can carry that," he said. "The dead don't argue with me. The living do." He put the parcel in Mercy's hands and left before thanks could tangle anything. They ate little and quickly, meat and corn cakes, and the kind of broth that coats a sore throat. Chaska handed Mercy a strip of jerky and a look that asked if she would try to run. She shook her head. She was not fool enough to outrun a rope and an army and a river in spring. The boys fought sleep in the way children do, when the day has given them too much, and they are afraid dreams will finish the job. Mercy lay on her side, close enough to feel their heat, and far enough to honor the line Red Willow kept. She listened to the small sounds of comfort in the dark. Red Willow's tuneless hum, the boy's breath catching and smoothing, Chaska's boot scuff as he checked a thing for the 12th time. The raid came when a coyote yipped downriver, and the moon slid behind a rag of cloud. 3 shadows peeled off the darker line below and came up hard and low. Men who had learned the shape of this bluff over years of jealous watching. They went straight for the edge of camp, where a woman would stand to take air and a man would stand to piss. But the sage line did its quiet work again. The first man stumbled. The second grabbed him and hissed. The third had the sense to fall back and lift a whistle to his lips. Chaska hit him in the wrist with a thrown stone so neat the whistle flew, and no sound came. Mercy did not think. She grabbed the closest firebrand and pushed it into the night like teeth. A face showed in orange, startled and mean. Kearney's deputy, the one with the scar down his ear. He saw her and grinned because he recognized a woman he thought he could drag. He lunged. She brought the brand up and hit the wrist that reached for her. The smell of singed hair went up like a bad prayer. He swore and came again harder, and this time 2 other shapes were at his back. The young kinsman knocked one flat with the butt of a rifle. Chaska took the other in the thigh, a quiet, efficient hurt that would slow him and not kill him. The deputy found Mercy's arm anyway. His fingers locked around bruised flesh, and pain cut her thinking. He yanked, and her boots skidded, and the world turned on its side. They moved her down the trail with a rag stuffed in her mouth and rope at her wrists, quick as men who fear the sun. Red Willow reached them too late for hands, and too early for grief. She placed both palms on Mercy's cheeks, as the deputy dragged her past and said in a voice that traveled into bone, "Look at me." Mercy looked. "Hold your breath underwater," Red Willow said, and Mercy nodded, as if that were a plan. The deputy laughed and shoved her forward. Chaska came low and fast along the left and took one man out of his saddle with a jerk that was more like harvesting than fighting. Then a gun butt found the side of Chaska's head in the tangle, and the sound it made Mercy's stomach flip. He stumbled and went to a knee, The deputy who had Mercy hauled her onto a waiting horse with a rope around her waist for safety that was not safety at all. They vanished into the cedar night with hoofbeats muddy as hearts. They ran her through the cottonwoods and down to where the ford made the river think it was shallow. It wasn't. It only pretended for men too proud to measure properly. Cold hit her legs like knives as the horse stepped in. She sucked a breath and remembered the only instruction given her. Hold it. The water rose to her knees, her hips, her belly. It hit the bruise in her shoulder and she had to bite the rag to keep from making a sound. The deputy gloated. You like water so much? Here's plenty. She counted 1, 2, breathed out hard and slow, then filled her lungs and held again. The horse stumbled once, swimming. Men cursed. A log tipped and bumped her thigh and spun away. They came out on the town side with mud in their boot tops and a cheer from 2 boys who had no idea what they were cheering. Kearney waited on the bank with a face shaved too close and eyes that had not slept. He looked pleased with himself in a way that would sour milk. Thought you could hide behind heathen skirts, he said, too loud, and for the benefit of the men who liked that sort of talk. Bring her. Judge is awake. Ropes ready. Gideon's Ford wore flood, like a poor man wears a borrowed coat, ill and embarrassed. Mud streaked the courthouse steps. The gallows had been fresh pitched that afternoon. The smell of pine tar and new hemp hung over the square like a church kiss, with wrong in it. Someone had swept the platform, as if cleanliness could make a dirty act fine. Lanterns burned along the porch rail, where men leaned, with hands tucked into belts, to look like authority. A woman with a baby on her hip stood back of them in the dark because curiosity and mercy often live in the same body and fight. Kearney hauled Mercy up the steps. Silas stepped out of the shadows of the clerk's office, with the book under his arm like a preacher. He was smiling again. He set the book on the rail and spread a paper on top. Declaration of safe return, he said, in a voice sweet enough to rot teeth. Sign and sleep in a warm room tonight. Deny obstruction. Tomorrow will look different. He slid a pen toward her like an old friend. The rag was gone from her mouth now. The rope at her wrists had been cut and reknotted at her waist. A kindness that was only to make writing easier. Mercy looked at the place on the paper where her name was meant to go. She looked at the cross marked already in the clerk's hand, where a witness mark would later be added. The cross sat on the wrong side of the line, as if the hand that drew it did not know where such things belong. She lifted her eyes and met Silas's. You put money on a coffin, she said, steady as a man setting his last nail. His smile did not falter, only the skin around his eyes tightened. I plan, he said. That's what keeps a town from eating itself. Kearney had the judge dragged from his bed for show, a man who had been sober once and had not been lately. He read a set of words someone had written for him, and then banged a gavel on nothing. We'll set a proper hearing next clear day, he said. Sheriff, secure the accused. He peered at Mercy, as if to remember what charge she wore. And get that mess off my steps before the river does it for you, he added, glancing at the flood scurf climbing the lowest stair. The crowd laughed in the way a crowd laughs. To forget it is cruel. They put Mercy in the undertaker's shed because the jail leaked. Jonah Pike's hands were soft when he bound her wrists to the rail with old silk instead of new hemp. It will hold for a house cat, he muttered, but not a person who wants out. His eyes told her what his mouth did not. He slipped a stub pencil into her palm, as if it were a wafer. If a thing needs writing, he said. If a thing needs hiding. He looked at the door, and then at the floor, and then at her shoulder. They hit your man with a wagon wheel, he said softly, and the words broke the little hold she had on herself. I sewed him neat, he added, as if neat could help, because for men like him, neatness is a mercy they know how to give. She nodded once and made the pencil disappear. Red Willow's words about the river came back to her in the damp of that shed when the dark lay heavy and the town creaked in its sleep like a boat. Mercy lay with the silk loose enough to slide if a hand tried it, and tried it. It gave. She sat up and rubbed feeling back into her fingers. She listened through the wall as Kearney argued with Graves. Graves wanted a morning hearing. Kearney wanted a night rope. The storm wanted the town. The first heavy drops pocked the roof with smacks that climbed into a drum. Water ran in the alley and found the low spot by the shed door and began to pool. Mercy stood and tested the latch. Jonah had left it stubborn, not locked. She lifted it and let the flood shoulder the door open an inch, then two. She could smell the river fresh and rank and hungry. A rat shot past her boot like a thought. She slipped out and into the alley, and the rain took her in both hands. They had not tied her ankles. She ran the way only a body near breaking runs. Economy and terror married. She stayed in the dark, where the lamplight broke and jumped, alley to alley, as men yelled about barrels and daughters, and loose pigs, and nothing about her. Water climbed the street like a rumor. She crossed pieces of it at a run, and felt it grab and let go. She turned into the undertaker's side yard, because he would not shut a door on a scared thing if he could help it. He met her in the dark, with his hands up, and did not pretend surprise. "This way," he said, voice a thread. He pulled the shed door back and let her into the space where he kept cloth and candles and the stretcher. He lifted a trap and set her under the floor in the hollow he used for bodies, when ground froze too hard to take them. There was no smell yet. He kept his work clean. "Do not move," he breathed, then dropped the hatch and laid a rug over it, and then a bench on top of that. Boots moved over the floor above her head, with the scuff that meant hurry and nerves and beer. Water found that space too, a thin lick at first, and then a cold mouth. It rose to her calves, and Mercy remembered Red Willow's instruction and slowed her breath as if she could slow the river. Jonah argued above her with a man who had come for a coffin and wanted two and could not count. His calm voice made a shelter where her body could not. The water climbed to her knees. The hatch lifted a hair with the pressure, and Jonah set a foot on it like a tired saint and hummed a hymn under his breath to drown the sound. When the men left, he moved the bench, rolled the rug, lifted the hatch, and held out a hand with fingers that shook. "No more," he said. "We move now." He led her through a back run where he kept offcuts of wood and odd lengths of rope, small ropes, nothing that would hold a man high, and out into the lane behind the tinsmiths, where the fence had broken under the weight of the flood barrels. He pointed to the alley that trickled toward the livery. "Stalls are high," he said. "Horses hate water. They'll be standing on the dry. The far stall has an old crawl space for the boy who used to sleep there. You can tuck in there, and the smell will keep men from nosing." He pressed something into her hand. The wrapped parcel he had given her on the bluff had been a shirt and a coil of soft cloth. This was different. It was a folded scrap torn from a ledger, ink bleeding at the edges from wet. "Read it. If a man says none of this can be proved," he said, eyes flat with a courage that looks like tired. "Speak it if I cannot." He put his hand on her elbow, and it was like the old life when decent hands had meant breakfast and a plan and not danger. "If you live," he said, "say my name true, not kind." The livery was a live thing in the flood. Wood complaining, a mare crying with the deep sound that says, she remembers the old rain when she was a foal and does not understand this new one that comes hard and wrong. Mercy slid along the wall and under the rail of the far stall and into the small dark space lined with straw that had not yet gone to rot. She tucked herself against the back and closed her eyes to keep from seeing every plank move. She listened. The mare shifted and put her nose down close and blew warm against Mercy's scalp like she had met her before. Mercy put a hand out, palm up. The mare mouthed it gently, as if tasting safety. Mercy put her forehead to the old rough wood and prayed the simple prayer of people who do not believe prayer works, but cannot stop, which is only a list of names said to the dark. She said her baby's name again, though no priest had written it. She said the boys' names. She said Red Willow and Chaska and Jonah. She did not say Silas. Some names you do not put into a prayer. Dawn did not come gentle. It came with the sound of barrels knocking together and boards wrenching and men yelling to get the rope higher because a river does not care for schedules or pride. The square filled with men who had slept badly and wanted to show it. Kearney's voice rode above the rest, thinner than it had been and more desperate. Graves shouted orders that were meant to be reason and sounded like begging. Silas kept to the lee of the clerk's porch, arguing with the book as if ink could be made to row against the current. Jonah Pike went about his business with a face that had been carved at birth for this, calm as winter, doing the small things that keep bodies from floating loose. He caught Mercy's eye once, through a slat in the livery wall, and did not show it. He could be counted on not to show it. They found her before noon, because Kearney turned the town upside down to set it back on its feet the way he liked them. A stable boy bragged he had seen a woman in the straw, and Kearney beat the brag into a direction. 4 men dragged Mercy from under the rail and took her across the flood-wet yard with the kind of roughness that comes more from fear than hate. She put her feet where she could and did not feed their urge to yank. They hauled her to the courthouse steps again, and this time the rope was already measured. The gallows creaked like a question. Graves tried for the form of justice as the water climbed the second stair. "We'll do this after the water goes," he said. "Bring her to the cells. The court cannot—" Kearney shouldered him aside with a push that knocked the flag loose. "The court is where I say," he said. "Town wants a throat to give the water. It will take hers." The crowd murmured, and then quieted, in that guilty way a crowd does. When it is about to watch something, it will pretend later not to have watched. Silas stepped forward with a paper folded neat. "Sign now," he said, "and this can all stop." Mercy looked at him, and then at the boy's medicine pouch tied around her own wrist now, with a strip of red willow's cloth. She had looped it there in the night, without thinking, as if some small life could be held by it. She said, "You paid for a box with no name." He smiled and let his eyes go soft, like a man winning a game he had been playing since childhood. "I plan," he repeated. "I told you." A wind came up that made the flag slap itself straight again. It smelled of broken cottonwood and the sweet rot of half-drowned hay. The flood reached the bottom of the gallows ladder and hesitated, like even a river wonders at a man's work sometimes. Kearney swore and set his hand to Mercy's upper arm. The boys screamed from somewhere in the throng, just 2 high notes that cut through everything and found her spine. She lifted her chin and found Red Willow's face beyond the shoulders and hats, still as a winter hill. Chaska stood to her right, where a store awning threw a false shadow. His eyes were not on her. They were on Kearney's hands, and the knot at the end of the rope and the angle of the second beam, where a man could climb if his legs were longer than most. He breathed in, and the air around him tightened like a bow. The town held its breath, and Mercy did the same, because old instructions save you in new ways. Jonah Pike stepped 1 pace out of the crowd, with the calm of a man going to fetch salt, and said in a voice he had used only at graves, "Sheriff, someone paid the parish for this funeral yesterday. The book shows a hand that is not the clerk's. Will you tell the town whose hand that is?" The crowd turned like a single head. Silas's smile did not leave his mouth, but it left his eyes. He said nothing. Kearney barked, "Get back, Pike," and took another step up the ladder. He had the noose in his right hand and the rope in his left, and 2 men who wanted to be brave at his back. This account carries more than 1 record. 1 page in the parish register shows a cross shaped by a hand that writes left when the clerk writes right. 1 line in the undertaker's ledger names a payer who tried to press ink where ink would not go. The sheriff's deposition, that will be read later, bears a burned edge where a name should live. Next, you will hear the words they meant to keep from the record, spoken out loud, where water can't wash them clean. The river lifted into the square with a sound like 1,000 small things breaking. The people on the steps swore and scrambled. A barrel floated into the gallows ladder and jammed there, stuck by its own empty. Men kicked it, and the water pushed back. Kearney cursed and reached down with the rope to hook it and free the ladder for his use. Chaska moved then, a slick thing up the side beam with hands that knew wood. He took the top of the gallows in a grasp that made the structure shudder, then slid along it like a man on a barn rafter. He reached the knot, cut once, and the rope fell into the water like a dead snake. The crowd gasped, and someone finally screamed, the scream they had been holding. Kearney spun and went for his pistol and got a hand on it, and then Graves's hand was on his wrist, and the two men strained against each other with their faces inches apart like men kissing wrong. Mercy stood on the platform and felt the boards shift underwater and knew the square would soon be a pool. From the alley behind the Tinners, 3 riders in plain clothes came in at a canter that looked like an accident. It wasn't. Their horses shouldered through men like fish. One slid under the awning and cut the last loop on Mercy's waist with a knife so quick she did not feel it until the rope fell. Another forced his horse sideways up the first step and made a wall of chest and shoulder and wet breath between Mercy and the hands reaching for her. The third hooked his fingers into the back of her dress and hauled with a gentleness that seems impossible in a fight. "Down," Chaska said, and she went without asking which way. They moved as a bundle into the alley, where the water ran lower and the ground rose, and the smell of old tin and new fear met and made a taste in her mouth, like nails. Behind them, the gallows listed. Men shouted about pins and posts. The barrel bobbed free and knocked a man to his knees. Jonah Pike's voice rose calm through all of it, reading something in a steady way that made men look even when they did not want to. Graves's shout cut the air. "Holster, Sheriff! That's an order!" A gun went off anyway. The shot took a chip off the courthouse rail, and no man, but all men flinched, as if they had been struck. They shoved Mercy into the undertaker's stable again, not into the crawl this time, but into the narrow aisle between the hearse and the wall, where the boards met at a seam that could be opened if you knew it. Jonah's hand found the seam from the outside and lifted it, and there was air and a thin run that led to the back of the Tinners, and from there to the old flood cut that had once been a road. They slid into that cut like fish into a cold. The boys' cries threaded the noise of the town behind them, not frantic now, but fierce. Red Willow moved like she was both their anchor and their spear. Mercy tasted metal and mud and a future made mostly of trouble. They ran the flood cut with water at their ankles and the town yelling over their heads like a fever. The ditch took them behind the blacksmiths, where the ground rose and old horseshoes lay like moons in the muck. Chaska whistled once, and the young kinsman peeled from shadow with the boys at his hip, Little Man running tight and quick, Tate clutching Red Willow's skirt with his whole hand so hard the knuckles went white. Mercy counted them without thinking. 1, 2, 3, and only after that breathed. Red Willow touched Mercy's cheek just once, brief as a drumbeat, and turned to the boys. "Heart slow," she said, "feet sure." They moved as if the ground were stitched for them, and they only had to find the thread. Behind, the square groaned like a ship. Graves's commands cracked and slid. Kearney's curses cut through like knives thrown blind. Silas Murdoc's voice went silky and slick. Mercy could hear him using words like neighbor and order and safety, each one polished till it looked like a mirror and showed only his face. They ducked under a sagged clothesline, and the wet shirt slapped Mercy's hair like cold hands. Chaska stopped them in a shadow and spoke low. "We cannot hold town," he said. "We cut only the rope. The rest is theirs to thrash." Red Willow nodded, seeing the shape of the day as a whole cloth. "One more thing," she said. Her eyes went to Mercy. What must be done in the open must be done now. They turned into the alley behind the clerk's office, where Silas stored goods in a locked shed that had been a stable once. Mercy knew the shed. She had leaned her back against its plank the winter before to catch breath after carrying flour that had weighed less than it should. The flood had swelled the lower boards and split one. Chaska put the tip of his knife to the split and pried, and the board sighed and came away. Inside, stacked to the roof, lay barrels and crates stamped with army marks, and then re-stamped with something new, a brand made to look official, the way a counterfeit coin can pass in a darkroom. Leather lay piled, dark and oiled, and recently cut, brow bands with their small identity marks, shaved clean, and under a tarpaulin with wax, rubbed into it to keep things safe from damp, sat a bundle wrapped in burlap and string. Red Willow reached without waiting. Her hand was inside that tar, Before Mercy could breathe, she pulled the burlap like a midwife draws a winding sheet, and the smell of old blood lifted into the wet air. Mercy knew the shirt before her eyes told her. The check pattern she had mended at the collar, the loose button she had meant to fix, and had not. The dark spread where the knife had gone in, and been pulled out, and gone in again. There was no accident in that. The blood had dried stiff. It had not been washed, only hidden. Mercy touched the cloth with 2 fingers, because touching is a way of naming, and said her husband's name once, small and clean. The boys stood still as fence posts. Chaska's jaw locked without moving. The stitch in Silas's cuff thread had found an echo in the fray, where the shirt's seam had torn. Jonah Pike appeared in the alley with his hat pulled low, and his ledger tucked inside his coat. He had a way of finding the seam between acts and stepping through. He set the ledger on the crate and opened it to a page blistered with water and guilt. "I wrote," he said, and his voice made the rain hush. "On the day a man fell under his wagon, I wrote that the payor told me to measure his widow for travel clothes against need. I wrote that the payor's gold was army gold cut small. I wrote that the mare he led had an old brand under a new. I wrote the payor's name. It is there, and if you burn that page, the ash will still tell it." He put a hand on the page, like a good man, keeping a promise. Mercy looked and saw the name, Silas Murdoch, writ clear in a hand that had washed bodies and would not lie. She had the ledger scrap he had given her in her pocket. The letters matched like teeth. "Bring it in today," Red Willow said. "Let the town look where it has been told not to." She lifted the bloodied shirt in both hands and let it hang like a flag that meant something truer than the one on the square. Mercy stood beside her with the ledger page Jonah had torn and the medicine pouch tied to her wrist. Chaska took the shaved leather strap and the rebranded bridle and the tar-stiff tarp and threw them over his shoulder like a sack of crimes. "Now," he said, and they went. They walked out of the alley not like thieves, but like a procession. Floodwater licked at their boots, and the crowd split without knowing why. People know when truth is carried. It makes space. Red Willow did not lift her chin. She did not need to. She stepped onto the first stair of the courthouse, where the water had climbed and stopped, holding the shirt high, and her voice came out level and slow, the cadence of a woman who has led children through fevers and men through grief and knows the difference. "Look," she said, "not at my face, at what the water brought to light." She turned the shirt so the cut showed. "This wound was not a wheel. It is a blade. A town that calls a blade a wheel is a town that has lost its tongue." Murmurs rose, sharp and low. A woman near the edge of the crowd made a sound like a little animal. Mercy recognized her by the baby on her hip, the same woman who had watched last night. She drew the child close and made a small protective circle with her arm. Kearney pushed forward with his jaw set like a trap. "Get them down," he snapped. "This is a riot." He reached for the shirt to tear it from Red Willow's hands. Chaska came 2 steps and put the bridle strap across Kearney's wrist and twisted. The sheriff hissed, and his knees buckled. Graves saw his chance and shouldered between them like a man moving a log in flood. "Enough," he barked, and for once the voice of an officer cut like it ought. He looked at the shirt, and then at Mercy, and then at Jonah Pike holding the ledger like a Bible. "That a true page?" he asked. Jonah met his eyes and did not blink. "By my hand," he said. Graves turned to Kearney. "Arrest him," Kearney said quickly, pointing at Chaska with the wild lunge of men who feel the ground shifting. "Arrest them all." Graves did not move. He let the words die. He looked past Kearney to Silas, who had edged backward into the shadow of the clerk's porch and found a place that had always opened for him. Graves's gaze went to the cuff, to the thread, to the way a man hides in the habit of hiding. "Mr. Murdoch," Graves said, clear as bells. "You'll come with." Silas laughed then. He had a way of laughing that tried to make you feel ashamed for not laughing with him. He opened his hands, as if to show he carried nothing, and in that small theatrical gesture, too much truth spilled loose. The cuff caught the light, and the thread showed its dull shine. Mercy lifted the ledger page in one hand and the medicine pouch in the other. "This thread was in a boy's throat," she said, not shouting, so the words had to be stepped toward, to be heard. I cut it to save him. That same twist of thread mended your sleeve last night. You rifled his pouch while he drowned. Silas's smile loosened at the edges, the way pitch peels when heat finds it. You imagine, he said. You always had big fancies. Red Willow's voice moved under Mercy's like a second river. The river remembers, she said. So does cloth. Silas made his choice then. He put his hand to his pistol, at the same time Kearney did, because fools often find each other at the end. Graves had been waiting for that choice since the day he came west, thinking order could be carried in a trunk. He moved so quick his horse spooked, drew, and fired. The shot hit Kearney high, a red flower opening where Law had sat dirty too long. Kearney slipped backward into the flood, and the water took him at knee, and then hip, and then shoulder, and he made a choking sound that was more surprise than pain as he went. Silas fired wild and hit nothing in this world. His second shot went into the porch rail and splintered a curl that landed at his feet like a question. Chaska took 2 steps, and the third was into Silas's space, and the butt of the rifle spoke once to the side of Silas's head in a wordless sentence that ended with him on his knees, the gun skittering into the water, where it spun and then sank, small and dark and gone. The crowd did not cheer. They inhaled and then did not exhale, because something sacred and ugly had passed, and both demanded silence. Graves lowered his pistol, as if it had become heavy. He looked around him at the men he commanded, and the men he had never commanded, and saw they were for the first time all looking at the same thing, a shirt and a page and a pouch and a town that suddenly knew its own reflection. Sheriff Elam Kearney is relieved, he said, voice raw. Under authority of the post, I take charge of this town until a federal marshal arrives. He nodded at 2 troopers. Take Mr. Modoc to the cells. Gentlemen, do not let him near a pen. The men waited and did as told. Silas did not fight because sometimes a man knows the tide long before he says so. The rain slackened, as if the sky had held back this long, so it could see the part where men tell the truth. The river bumbled around the gallows legs like a dog that has knocked something over and is sorry. Red Willow folded the shirt like a flag and handed it to Mercy. Mercy pressed it to her sternum and felt all the days she had lived with, and before and after, stack there and make a weight she could carry. Jonah Pike closed his ledger and tied it with its own string and put it in his coat. He looked older by a year in the span of an hour. I will say what I saw, he said to Graves. Graves nodded, and that simple nod paid back a part of a debt no one had written down. They left that town by the back way, while men argued in new shapes. Graves stopped them once at the edge of the flood cut. Mrs. Delaney, he said, and the name in his mouth had none of the cheapness it had carried in others. If you ever want to speak into a room where the paper thinks it has the last word, I will make that room. Mercy nodded. Make sure the clerk learns which hand draws across, she said. He almost smiled. I will, he said. He looked at the boys then, at their narrow shoulders and scraped knees, and looked away because some sights carve a man whether he wants them to or not. They went home to the bluff, not because it was safe, but because it was theirs. The river had gnawed a new bite out of the bank and spit a willow trunk, end over end, into the shallows. The little shelter still stood, smoke curling from its lips like a winter mouth. Red Willow put the boys in dry shirts and set them to sorting a bowl of beans, black from white, because small work is a prayer that sticks. Mercy set the bloodied shirt across a rock and poured clean water over it till the red bled thin and the cloth looked like a wound that had been washed but would scar. Chaska stood by the edge where the bank had gone and spat into the flood and said a word to it that was not an apology and not a dare. At dusk, the winter count-keeper called them with a shake of his stick against his palm. People mean by handfuls came to the circle, kinsfolk and kin by trouble, men whose shoulders carried more than meat, women who held babies, with the kind of attention that is half guard and half him. The old man unrolled the hide slow and smoothed it with the flat of his hand where it had wrinkled. He tapped with the stick along the years. Snow, sickness, buffalo winter. the year of red grass, the year the soldiers came with paper, until he tapped the blank place, waiting for this year. He looked at Mercy as if measuring whether a strange thing could hold a symbol without breaking it. Red Willow nodded, without speaking. The boys watched with their lips apart, because they had been nearly taken and had been given something instead, and children can smell that swap in a room. The old man dipped a sharp bone into soot and fat. Then he held it out, not to Chaska, not to Red Willow, but to Mercy. Her hand shook a little, and then found itself steady. She set the tip down gentle, and made a white figure with arms out, drawn simple and true, and two small stick children, bound to that figure by a rope, like a river turned soft. She drew a blue stroke under them, to be the water. It wavered because water does. She lifted the bone, and waited. The old man grunted approval soft in his chest. "This year," he said, "we mark the flood that wanted boys, and got a rope instead." Then he did a thing no man there had seen him do, for anyone not born under that hide. He took a single eagle feather from a wrap, and turned it in his hands, as if he were warming it. He placed it not in Mercy's hand, which could put it in hair, and lose it, but at her braid himself, gentle and exact, like setting a last stone into a wall. "You have a name with us," he said, and the name he spoke held the river, and the act you make with hands, when you refuse to let go. Red Willow said it after him, so Mercy would hear it in a woman's voice. Chaska did not smile, because a man keeps certain things settled in his face, but the set of him went easier, like a bow unstrung. Children drift toward sleep at ceremonies like leaves find the edges of a pond. Tate sagged against Mercy's hip, without asking permission, and Mercy took that weight as if she'd been born for it. Little man made a small show of sitting up straight, and then fell over on Red Willow's lap, and breathed in the rhythm of men who have been pulled from water and planned to stay on land. Night came quick and starred. Coyotes argued over something far off, and then quit. The river kept up its talk, because it has as many mouths as stones. In the morning, they carried the shirt and the ledger page to the place where Mercy stacked her few keepsakes. The warped Bible, the little tin the midwife had pressed into her hand the day her baby failed, a square of cloth from a dress her mother had sewn back, when cloth still came out by way of ships. Red Willow added a twist of the cut thread from Silas's cuff, taken with a quiet pinch, when the soldiers had him by the wrists, and were looking at his feet. "Let town keep its paper," she said, laying the thread on the shirt sleeve. "We keep what we can touch." Mercy nodded. She had spent a year learning that the things you can touch sometimes outlast the ones you can read. Word came by way of a rider 2 days later that the federal marshal had sat behind the clerk's desk and called Graves decent and Kearney dead, and Silas bound for a larger court. People would argue in that court as if the river had not spoken in the square, but the shirt and the page and the pouch had moved men whose boots grew out of that soil, and arguments wear down against such. Jonah Pike marked a line in his ledger in neat print. "On the day the water climbed the courthouse steps, I saw a woman saved by those who owed her nothing, and a town saved from itself by the flood." Then he shut the book and went to wash a body with the care he gave them all. Mercy learned the path between the bluff and the little creek so well she could walk it in dark without turning her ankle. She mended children's shirts and cut meat, and taught little man a game with stones that keeps the mind sharp when the weather doesn't. She slept lightly and woke early, and became the sort of person whose name is said before dawn when a child coughs. Red Willow once put a hand on Mercy's hair and did not remove it quickly, which is the measure some women use for love. Chaska came and went without fanfare, in the way men do when they have taken a job upon themselves that no one can write on paper. He brought words from the winter count when it was right to bring them, and kept them when it was not. He taught Mercy where to put her feet when a bluff breaks, and where to cut a fish so the bones let go. Mercy taught him how to make numbers sit straight in the head, and what letters can do to keep a promise alive after the mouth that spoke it is gone. One evening when the cottonwoods turned their leaves to show the silver undersides, and coyotes trotted out along the ridge like men on a Sunday walk. The boys brought Mercy a twisted willow stick with a small knot tied halfway down. "You keep," Tate said, solemn as a judge, "so you will not forget to breathe underwater." Mercy laughed, the kind that opens the chest. She kissed each boy's hair because some customs cross every line. She set the stick by the door to her shelter like a talisman, which it was. There are 2 pages you can ask to see if you want to know the rest. On the winter count robe, the flood glyph shows a white figure with 2 small shadows tied to it by a rope of blue. A thumb smudge blurs the water stroke where someone touched it before it dried, and the thumbprint has a pattern in it you can't mistake once you've seen it. And on the sheriff's deposition, the lower corner burns into a dark bite where a name once lived and does not now. Put the 2 side by side, and you can decide whether cloth and hide tell truer than ink when the river is judge. If the robe travels again, you'll know which picture to find by the blue line under the year and the rope that looks like a river turned soft. If the clerk opens the county book, you'll know which page to hold up to the light, the robe's blue rope or the county's burned corner. Which tells the truth? Comment your verdict and subscribe for the next ledger.